Hello, everyone. Welcome to Network of Neighbors Violence Intervention Training. I'm your facilitator, Jennifer Gordon.
And I'm Rachel Welser.
And we are here on behalf of Feminist Shift to take you through this training today. A little bit about Feminist Shift. We're an advocacy project between YW Kitchener-Waterloo and YWCA Cambridge, focused on addressing and preventing gender-based violence in Waterloo region. We use an intersectional feminist lens in our work, and we focus on both acts of violence as well as the conditions that inform them, things like housing, poverty, childcare, employment. We are funded by Women and Gender Equality Canada. This specific project, the Network of Neighbours, is a training initiative to support neighbors and train them to act as supports for those experiencing violence at home. This community-wide training pushes back against the shadow pandemic, which is the name given to describe the increase in gender-based violence that has happened during COVID-19. This project is funded by Canadian Women's Foundation Safe and Stronger grants. Before we get going, we want to do a land acknowledgement. The Feminist Shift, our work primarily happens in Waterloo region, so our land acknowledgement is with that in mind. Waterloo region is situated on the unceded land of the Haldimand Tract and is within the territory of the neutral Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee people. On October 25th, 1784, after the American Revolutionary War of Independence, the Haldimand Tract was returned to the Six Nations of the Grand River and the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation by the British as compensation for their role in the war. Of the 950,000 acres returned, less than 5.1% remains under Indigenous ownership today. To do anti-violence work on this land, we must acknowledge how colonialism continues to feed violence in our region and to affirm our commitment to decolonization in our work and in our lives as settlers on this land. Allyship is a continuous process. It is not a designation that one can earn and hold forever or a label one can give themselves. Allyship is earned through actions. We have a responsibility as beneficiaries of this land to acknowledge and understand its history and the current experiences of First Nation, Inuit, and Métis people, and to be accountable to the violence they continue to face. We must use this understanding to inform our work to ensure we do not perpetuate the harms of colonization and begin to repair them. Members of Feminist Shift, Rachel and myself included, hold ourselves and our community accountable to the continuous work of decolonizing. We join in the feminist calls countrywide to end systemic oppression and address gender-based violence due to colonization, including immediate actions to end the epidemic of Indigenous women, girls, and two-spirit individuals going missing or being murdered.
In today's workshop, we're going to cover 4 sections. So section 1, we'll talk a little bit about the basic terms, type of abuse, intersectionality, reflexivity, and what you need to know about violence. In section 2, we talk about allyship and harm reduction as a way to reduce harm experienced as a consequence of violence. In section 3, we talk about pointed interventions, review bystander training, fleeing violence, prevention talks, and calling law enforcement. And in section 4, we talk about post-intervention follow-up. You did the thing, now what? So section 1, laying the foundation, what you need to know about violence. When you start supporting people or looking into resources to support people living with domestic violence, there's a whole bunch of terms that come up. Those terms all mean different things, but similar things. So we're going to help clarify some of those today. Interpersonal violence is violence that is experienced between 2 people or multiple people. Domestic violence is violence experienced between people within a household. So usually those people are in a relationship, they live together. Intimate partner violence refers to 2 partners. There's violence within that relationship, but they may not live together. Gender-based violence is a large term speaking about violence experienced on the basis of gender. Statistically, the number of people who experience domestic violence identify as female or trans or non-binary individuals. To reflect that lived reality, we will often refer to your neighbor using she, her, or they, them pronouns. However, we recognize that it is not an exclusive experience for people who only identify as female, trans, or non-binary. So the information we present to you today will work to support people no matter where they identify on the spectrum. Types of abuse. There's several different types of abuse. As we move through this, I really encourage you to remember that abuse is a contextual experience. It is not necessarily made up of only one thing. Physical abuse is harm using bodily contact. Verbal abuse is harm using words. Sexual abuse is harm using forced sexual contact. Mental abuse is harm using words and nonverbal cues meant to traumatize. Emotional abuse is harm using words and nonverbal cues meant to distress. Financial abuse is harm through the control of money. Spiritual abuse is harm using religion or spirituality. It's really important to remember that violence can be both an acceleration of acts or it can be about deprivation and neglect.
When we're talking about supporting people through violence, it's really important for us to take note of two different elements: intersectionality and reflexivity. Using these together will allow you to reduce harm and increase your impact for support. So by definition, intersectionality talks to the interactions between social categories. So we're talking about things like gender, race, class, culture, age, ability, sexuality, etc. And how with each of these social categories, there's privilege or oppression and discrimination attached. And that's amplified as people identifying with these social categories experience systems and the processes of oppression: sexism, patriarchy, racism, classism, colonialism, ageism, ableism, homophobia, etc. This is a really loaded definition, so we want to break it out a little bit more. You're going to see here three familiar faces potentially. These are very familiar emojis from the iPhone series. On the far left-hand side here, you see David. David is a white male in his 40s. Sally in the middle is a queer female, white passing, in her 40s. And Jade on the far side is a Black woman in her 40s. She has a visible disability. You can see her service dog in behind. So what we're going to do is we're going to take those social categories from the slide before, and we're going to start to pull out where this might provide privileges or oppressions based on these three folks and the identities that they identify with. So we're going to start with David over here. You can see in David's right hand, left hand, if you're looking at it, these green boxes are stacking up. These are his privileges. Essentially, David has privilege from almost every social category that he belongs to. That's called the patriarchy. However, if we break this down a little bit further, David being a white male means his culture and his race work as privilege for him. As a male, his gender works as privilege for him. His class, we don't know David's working situation, but if we put David, Sally, and Jade in the same job doing the same work at the same time, chances are very likely that David would be paid more for that same work. In terms of sexuality, David's straight, which acts as a privilege for him. His age, being working age and contributing, is seen as a privilege. And his ability, he doesn't have a visible disability. So that works as a privilege. When we start to pull out the privileges for Sally and Jade, you see Sally here, she gets privilege from her race and culture as being white passing. Her class, again, if Sally and Jade were in the same job, started at the same time, doing the same tasks, chances are Sally, as a white passing woman, would earn more for that same work than Jade. Age, again, being in their 40s, Sally being in her 40s and contributing. Ability, does not have a disability, so that works as a privilege. When you move over to Jade over here, you see that Jade has two social categories that are giving her privilege. Her sexuality is a straight female and her age, being in her 40s. If you're going to put Jade and David in the same scenario, utilizing some of the same resources, you can notice already that David and Jade's experience in our community would be very different. However, when we start to pull out the oppression side, we see what's really working, stacking up against. So for Sally being female, that works as an oppressor, as well as her sexuality being queer. For Jade, on the other hand, race and culture, not being white or white passing, works as an oppressor. Gender, being female, works as an oppressor. Class, again, the same scenario of work. Jade is likely to get paid less for that similar work. And then ability, Jade has a visible disability that works as an oppressor. So if we start to take into account some of the systems that we use in our society. So if we look at things, or systems even more so that we come into play if you're supporting someone fleeing violence or dealing with a violent relationship. If we look at law enforcement, healthcare services, social services, banking, and other entities, employment, other entities like that, these systems are designed to benefit David. right? So David and his social categories and how he identifies within those social categories give him privilege in all of those systems. But if you move over here to Jade and you realize the amount of oppression that Jade is experiencing based on those social categories, you're going to know that Jade's experience in these different systems is going to be very different. This is what I want you to hold on to. These are just 3 examples of 3 people who hypothetically exist. Intersectionality is not a prescription. There's many scenarios and factors that go into it. However, we need to keep in mind that not everyone is walking around with that stack of privilege that David is. And that often, depending on where we land on these social categories, we can make assumptions on other people's experiences. So what I mean by that is reflexivity. So reflexivity is your ability to understand your own experiences of systems and the privilege that you may have because of the social categories you belong to. So if we look again, where you fall with culture, ability, age, sexuality, class, gender, and race. Further, it explores what assumptions you might make on others' experiences based on your own social categories and the privilege and oppression you get from them. So we have some questions for you to ask yourself. We're going to go over these here, but they're going to come back several times throughout our workshop. The first question is reaction. So often people will base their support in these scenarios based on their initial reaction, right? So you want to understand what your impulse reaction was, what were your thoughts, feelings, actions, etc., and why did you react that way? You want to understand your baggage. How might your beliefs, your political leaning, past experiences you've had, your culture, religion, etc., be impacting you in this scenario or situation? What are your givens? So what assumptions are you making about the situation given your own social location and privilege and oppression? And then what else? What are some potential different ways this situation could be experienced by someone who has less privilege than you? Your actions when you're doing this work need to reflect 1 through 4, right? By looking at 1 through 4, you're going to understand what your options are for action, and you're going to be able to avoid those moments where you base your support on your own personal experience without taking into context someone else's privilege and oppression.
The power and control wheel is a common tool used when speaking about domestic violence. It was developed by Ellen Pence, Michael Paymar, and Coral McDonald, who were researchers that attended the violence against women's groups to learn about women's experiences while in abusive relationships. What you see on the graphic is the internal colors are tactics that are used to reinforce the abuser's power and control. When those tactics like intimidation or emotional abuse aren't reinforcing the abuser's power and control, the abuser resorts to the outer circle of physical or sexual violence. I'm going to read a scenario and we will go through that as a way to explain the graphic. On a bright and sunny day, you're sitting on your back deck when you hear the sliding door of the house beside you open. Your neighbor steps out and you hear something to the tune of, "Outside time is over. The dishes need doing. You're the woman and it's your responsibility. I go to work all day to make the money because clearly you're too stupid to get a job." They walk back inside and you continue to hear muffled yelling and dishes shattering. The easy pull away from this is intimidation. We're hearing dishes shattering. We're hearing that the abuser has come outside, has created this culture of fear in the sense that they've come outside, decided what's going to happen, and what happens is reinforced by a threat of physical violence, which is on the exterior rim of the circle. However, other things that are present here is economic abuse. The abuser is saying, "I make the money." He controls the resources. You're seeing male privilege. The abuser is defining gender roles within the relationship. We're seeing isolation. The abuser has come out and really ended that person's experience outside, saying outside time is over. The abuser is using coercion and threats to enforce the abuser's partner, the woman or your neighbor, into doing what they want in order to maintain power and control in their relationship. So when we're thinking about the cycles of abuse, I think most people start with the honeymoon phase. We think relationships start there, but the cycle of an abusive relationship actually starts at the tension building phase. During the tension building phase, one partner feels as though they're unable to please the other. They're walking on eggshells. Nothing is making the other partner satisfied. So that is identified with doors slamming, dishes breaking, tension, frustration, and it leads into this acute or crisis phase of the relationship where we really start to see the physical violence, assault, death threats, an explosive dynamic where the abuser is really exercising control over their partner. Now, after that phase, it gets smoothed over by this calm or honeymoon phase. And that's where the abuser really sinks in those hooks of manipulation. So during this time, the abuser may be buying gifts, making promises about the future, making new plans for the future. They're extremely kind, extremely loving. And the thing to remember when we're supporting people living with violence in their home is that this is a cycle. And the honeymoon phase will lead into the tension building phase, and it will lead into the acute and crisis phase, and the circle repeats. So common warning signs of abuse. This is a relatively common thing to find on the internet if you're looking to support someone. But my perspective on this is if somebody in your neighborhood is non-committal to plans, or they're acting sad or lonely or withdrawn, or you notice that they're hiding bruises or injuries, or they're nervous talking about someone, that's a good person to check in on. We don't know that that person's experiencing abuse, but we do know that maybe checking in will give somebody an opportunity to let us know what's going on, or at least know that they're seen by their neighbors. That can be a really good thing during a pandemic. We want to check in on anyone who's experiencing isolation, who's apologetic or defensive when people bring up their partner's behavior. We want to check in on people who maybe don't have access to or control of their finances, or who have ongoing unreasonable self-blame or low self-esteem.
When it comes to isolation, we wanted to focus in a little bit more strategically, partially because isolation is like water to a plant. It's what makes abuse thrive. It's one of the more common red flags that you'll notice that might tip you off that there's an abusive relationship afoot. But it's also one of the more common tactics used to both ingrain somebody in an abusive relationship, but also enhance the depth of that abusive relationship. So it's this idea of being cut off from family, friends, and activities. The reason why we wanted to go over this is because this is even more prominent in a pandemic setting. So we've noticed that throughout this pandemic, the last number of months, we've seen a number of different public health strategies initiated that have really been designed to try and keep us all safe, to support each other, to make sure that we get out of this as unharmed as we can as a community. However, with that, we've seen things like lockdowns and stay-at-home orders, sometimes lasting months at a time. We're told to keep small social circles around us, and we're told within those circles to practice social distancing. There's been a disruption in services, and what I mean by that is these natural ingrained ways of somebody engaging with people in their community. So it could be, library services or social services, but it could be a process of going to the grocery store and saying hello to your favorite cashier, or going and getting your hair cut, other things like that. So we've seen a disruption in these sort of natural avenues that would break isolation for someone who's experiencing it at home. There's been added stress, and then all of this has just created this new tolerance and understanding around the depth that isolation can take and should take. So we all know that the more we do these things, the more we're rewarded, the better we feel about ourselves, the more that we're contributing to society. However, when home isn't safe and we're talking about lockdowns, smaller social circles, and social distancing, it really makes isolation grow at a magnified rate. So when we're talking about how isolation works within an abusive relationship, here's some ways that it manifests. So with more isolation, there's less people to check up on the person or your neighbor's safety or well-being. Signs of abuse go unnoticed, and just kind of like a kid getting away with doing something bad. The same kind of context comes in here. When the signs of abuse go unnoticed, it links to repeated experiences and often more intense experiences. There's a degree of disorientation that comes in as someone experiences isolation. So this means the more isolated a person is, the more dependent they are on their abuser. This can be dependent on a variety of different things, including information and what they're being told. And when we talk about that, we talk about how isolation brings us uninterrupted opportunity for grooming. And what I mean by grooming is this whole idea of molding the behaviors of the abused partner from the abuser, feeding different information, controlling in a whole new way. And there's nobody within their network saying, hey, that seems a little bit weird, or I don't think you should really have a say in this. Nobody is interrupting that grooming and that rhetoric. And then lastly, relationships are severed. So it's harder for the victim to reach out for help. So when they do end up in these pivotal moments where they are trying to flee the violence or in another sort of defining moment, they don't have as many relationships or people to count on. It's interesting because when doing this workshop prep, I had to kind of take a moment because there's people within my life, and I'm sure you can resonate as well with people in your life who kind of fit the bill of not showing up or never answering their phone, or are never available to do anything, or cancel plans shortly after they've made them. As a friend, that can feel very disheartening and feel personal. However, when you think of isolation and how it works, it could also be a cue that something more is going on. That's not a guarantee. Maybe that person just doesn't want to hang out with you. But in the case that that's not the case, it's always good to check in those scenarios and see if there's more going on. I'm a bit of a community nerd. And so I started thinking about folks that would be listening in on this recording and doing this training with us, and how they're probably also really connected in their communities. And I thought, well, there's some ways that we could probably build in some community protective actions that can push back against the power of isolation. So that's not to say everybody who's isolated is experiencing abuse. It's just isolation gets abuse going faster. So on the left-hand side here, we have isolating factors, and on the right, we have community protective action. So an isolating factor might be somebody being new to the neighborhood. A community protective action could be an intentional introduction. So more than a smile and a wave from the sidewalk, but actually making the connection, getting to know people's names. I go back to that sort of example of like the 1970s welcome wagon, where very intentional introductions and welcoming were done. Language barriers. So we all know how alienating and isolating speaking a different language can be than the people around us. I would encourage people to reach out to their greater network within their communities. There's a likelihood that somebody is speaking that similar language. There are interpreter services. However, don't be creepy about this. Don't just show up on someone's door with an interpreter. Try and get some element of consent before you go that route. And then last but not least, you can also use apps. We talk about Google Translation. It's not a perfect translation service. However, it's enough for basic conversation. Will allow you to start to break through some of those barriers and start to create meaningful relationships with folks that are speaking primarily different languages. Racism and discrimination, we see a lot of action on this after an event has happened. There's hate, graffiti, or other things, and the community comes together and says, not here, we don't accept this. However, I'm encouraging folks to have some of these conversations, speak up, and encourage others to speak up before those things happen. Make it very clear that this will not be an isolating factor in your community or something that is tolerated. And then lastly, we have the bad reputation house. I'm sure many people have an idea in mind of a house in their neighborhoods that fit this description. And it might be that there's always police called, or it's loud, less kept, other things going on. It has a reputation. It's the type of house where people say, well, we crossed the road, or we don't go that way anymore, etc. What I really want to try and encourage is for people to think about the fact that people in bad reputation households also deserve support and also deserve a neighbor that cares about them. So to try and hold gossip accountable and discover things for yourself, and to not let a bad reputation keep you from being involved. So we have here the buddy system. So these are some organizations within Waterloo region that are working together around domestic violence. By no means do we actually call ourselves the buddy system. However, I thought it was a kitschy little title. There is a full member list at dartwaterloo.ca/member-organizations. You can see the link in the bottom right-hand corner, and we'll provide it on our website in with the recording of this training. The buddy system here, I want to start with the YW Kitchener-Waterloo. That's the organization that Rachel and I belong to. We have emergency shelter. Rachel will go over this further on in our intervention section. However, that emergency shelter can be a first stop for people fleeing violence, as well as other folks who might be dealing with violence and find themselves in need of shelter. KW Counseling Services, they have sliding scale counseling suited for folks who are experiencing violence, but also have a Safe Mom, Safe Kids program where kids who have witnessed violence are able to come in and work with their moms around resiliency, safety planning, and other great things. The Waterloo Region Sexual Assault and Domestic Violence Treatment Center. This is run more of a medical model run through St. Mary's Hospital in Kitchener. They connect you in with a social worker and a nurse. The purple circle at the bottom, SASC, Sexual Assault Support Center. So this organization works in primarily with sexual assault, providing counseling and supports. However, they also have a family violence support program, court support program specifically, that will assist families going through a court process related to violence. On the top right corner, you see Woolwich Community Services coming in and representing our township. They provide counseling support for individuals who have experienced violence. Horizon has a family violence hub model where they bring together a variety of different organizations, some of which listed here and on dartwaterloo.ca, that will support a family through the violence that they've experienced. The Dragonfly, this is Women's Crisis Services. They are primary support for domestic violence for women who experience and female identifying who experience domestic violence in Waterloo Region. They have 2 shelters, one in Kitchener, one in Cambridge. They have outreach services that will provide outreach to folks who have newly moved into their own places from abusive relationships, and in some cases might potentially still be in that abusive relationship. They also do public education. And then lastly, Family Counseling Center of Cambridge and North Dumfries, coming in and representing the township of North Dumfries and Cambridge. These folks provide counseling support for those who have experienced violence. Again, these are just some of the organizations that will show up for you as you provide the support. For a full list, visit dartwaterloo.ca.
So now we're on to section 2, allyship and harm reduction, using relationships to fight violence. So this section, the thoughts that keep us from getting involved, comes from a bit of a personal place for me. I've had experiences where I wanted to get involved, but there were a number of things that kept me from doing so. So we're going to walk through it together. The thought might be, you feel like you'll make things worse by getting involved. I challenge you to consider that checking in with the person you're concerned about provides them with an opportunity to tell you if and how you can help. The thought might be that if you thought they wanted help, they'd ask. I challenge you to consider that maybe they're too afraid, too ashamed, or they don't know that they have another option. The thought might be that both partners are your friends. I challenge you to consider that one of your friends is being abused and lives in fear. The thought might be that you're afraid they'll become angry with you. Maybe, I challenge you to consider, at least they'll know you care. The thought might be that you don't think they want to leave. I challenge you to consider that they may not have the support or know that it's an option to leave. The thought might be you think it's a private matter. I challenge you to consider that it isn't when it's abuse. As support people for people going through violence, it is our role as allies to make sure that we are doing the best job possible to really support them. And so we're going to run through a very quick tutorial on allyship to help you with this process. About being an ally is you really have to listen. You have to set aside all of your own judgments and focus on what the person you're supporting is saying. You want to validate their experiences as the second piece. You want to move on to let them lead, support their decisions, and welcome the discomfort. The reality is that being an ally can come with parts of it that aren't so pleasant. Things that we learned we did wrong, things that we learned we could have done differently. This is all part of the process, and that's the value of allyship. Another key part of being an ally is making sure that we show up. It's important to stay engaged with the people we're supporting. We need to practice speaking up. So meaning that if that person is not around, you are still holding that same stance you're holding in front of them. You want to make sure you're accountable. If you've said something or you've made a mistake, that's okay. That's a part of the process. Being an ally means you're committing to learning from your mistakes and doing.
Okay, when we look at using a harm reduction approach, it's this idea that we're building relationships to reduce the severity of abuse and minimize harm. One of the hard things with this concept is the idea that you're not stopping the abuse. The abuse is going to continue. And as it continues, you're just trying to find different ways that you can intercede that allow you to reduce the harm and impact of that violence. So you need to be okay with the fact that the person that you care about, your neighbor, etc., is still going to experience violence daily. By definition, harm reduction is to lessen the frequency and intensity of negative social and physical impacts caused by violent human behaviors. You probably hear harm reduction used in public health settings, however, it's very applicable in this interpersonal violence. So you want to lessen the impact of the violence that your neighbor is experiencing in their abusive relationship. There's a few different ways of applying this sort of rhetoric or knowledge or theory to your support. Learning and listening, safe and routine connecting, planning, noticing disclosures, building in self-care, and then again, understanding reflexivity when it comes to harm reduction. So starting with learning and listening. For this, you really want to ask questions that are very strategic to help you learn how to reduce the impact of the violence. So you want to ask questions like what a good day looks like compared to what a bad day looks like with their abusive partner. You want to know if there's any trends. Are there days where that are more safe than others? So for example, I interviewed a woman once who knew that on Sundays, violence wasn't going to come her way because she was religious, her family was very religious, and her husband honored that. So she knew she was safe on Sundays. However, on Tuesdays, due to a scenario with work, we're almost always going to be nights of severe abuse and activities of violence because of their partner's work scenario. So understanding information like that and other things like how the abusive partner acts around other people comparative to how they act behind closed doors, these are all things that we can use to help formulate a plan. So for example, if an abusive partner is really nice when other people are around and you know that Tuesdays are a really bad day, perhaps you're the incessant neighbor that keeps showing up with a casserole or whatever on Tuesdays, or knocks on the door to ask a silly question or a relevant question on Tuesdays. You're able to disrupt that time by engaging on Tuesdays in a certain way that you know is safe. However, for some folks, having somebody knock on the door, the abusive partner might find that a threat and might actually lash out at their partner for trying to get somebody involved, or might feel some sort of threat that way. So if you go and knock on the door on Tuesday, you also have the opportunity to potentially make the scenario worse. So by asking these questions, you understand where it might be good for you to be able to support the person, and you can work together to help reduce the harm and severity of those violent moments. When it comes to safe and routine connecting, what I mean by this is that you want to find a safe way of talking. So for some folks, that might be online. For some, it might be texting. For some, you might just have to have it in person or only communicate in person or through a mutual friend or family member. However that looks, you want to find a way that's safe, because often people are monitored, and if somebody knows an abusive partner knows that you're supporting your neighbor, that could be a trigger and other things. So you want to find the best way to communicate with each other. And you want to do this routinely. So for example, if the best way of communicating is actually doing it face-to-face in person where there's no paper trail, and you know that every Wednesday at 4 o'clock, you're going to meet by the mailboxes at the end of the street. You're going to grab your mail. You're going to have a quick check-in, and that's going to be your routine connecting. If you end up at the mailboxes and your neighbor isn't there, that can be another indication that something more is going on, that there could be something, maybe they're in a tension. They've exited the tension building phase and they're into a sort of that acute crisis phase. It could be that there's imminent harm on the table, but it's a cue for you to understand that something is not right and that you need to check in further. You won't always have the opportunity to ask someone every day how they're doing, so this is another just safety measure. When it comes to planning, so Rachel's going to talk to you all a little bit later on about safety planning in terms of what to do if you're fleeing, helping someone flee a relationship. But you also want to do safety planning in terms of your role with that individual. So talking about things like wishes around law enforcement, like when you would want them to get involved, what sort of signs should you be looking for that identify imminent risk for her? How is interrupting, if you hear yelling, is interrupting going to be something that creates safety, or is it going to work the other way? All of those things, understanding their wishes around law enforcement. When do you involve the police? Do you involve the police? Are there other people in that person's life that they would rather engage? Is there a continuum? And then lastly, researching for referrals and supports. Often when we consider some of the factors around isolation, particularly disorientation and that grooming piece, stories are being fed to the person who's experiencing abuse. Like, you can try and leave, but if you leave, your citizenship will be revoked, or you can leave, but you're going to have no money, or you're going to have no resources, or there's nowhere for you to go. Whatever sort of story might be being told to this person, chances are that their internet use and other research opportunities, like for them to use research, are being monitored. So that abusive partner is going to know their actions online. Chances are your internet is not being monitored by that person. So try and do that research, look for referral supports, answers to questions, other opportunities, so that you're able to kind of plan together if you do move towards an intervention down the line.
Noticing disclosures. This is a really important piece because while we've listed off quite a few suggestions of things you might hear, you need to remember that it's immediately followed by a justification. So as an example, somebody might say, my partner doesn't like it when. The other half of that sentence could sound like, but he's tired after he gets home from work, or I did this wrong. So when we go through this, I'm going to read the first half of the disclosure and then follow it up with a justification to get you a little bit used to how people may present this information. He doesn't like it when I don't do the dishes, but he had a long day at work. He just wants a clean house. It's totally normal. My partner gets angry a lot, but the kids are really frustrating. He pops off, but you know what? I forgot to get the thing that he really asked me to, and I can't believe I forgot to do that. My partner likes things a particular way or else. He doesn't like living in a dirty home. It might be normal. So keep in mind as I read through the rest of the disclosures that there's justifications that are going to come after the beginning of this, and it's a good opportunity for you as an ally to check in and see what the situation is. He's in charge of the money. We aren't allowed to. He won't let me. My partner has a bad or short temper. He wants things just so. He doesn't like it when I have to walk on eggshells around him. He's hard on the kids. The thing we know about disclosures is that if somebody discloses an experience of abuse and it is not well received, they are far less likely to disclose in future. So it's important that we know how not to respond to disclosures. We don't want to tell someone that they're smarter than that and they just need to leave. We don't want to say things like this disclosure will hurt your community, your family, your friends. We don't want to say things like, at least he's not hitting you every day. We don't want to ask somebody who is experiencing abuse how they provoked it. And we don't want to tell them to forgive or turn the other cheek. And the important things are that we don't pressure somebody into changing their circumstance, but we let them know they're there. We are here to help them if they want it. We don't want to demonize their abuser, but we do want to validate their experience of abuse. This is beyond their control. We don't want to push them towards actions they're not ready for or wanting, but we do want to be there to listen and stay connected. We don't want to excuse abusive behavior, but we do want to encourage our neighbor to remember that this isn't their fault. Building in self-care. So when we were designing this workshop, I thought this was such a weird spot for a self-care slide, but honestly, it's kind of genius. As somebody who's attending this workshop, I trust that you have a capacity to recognize when you might need self-care. There's all sorts of ways that we can do that, but what we want you to think about in this moment is when your neighbor might need self-care. So if you are trying to build in some routines, get some safe communicating in there, and you and your neighbor go for walks, that's awesome. But the neighborhood can be really triggering. People don't want to worry about being judged or being gossiped about. So maybe instead of walking around the block, we take that walk out to the forest. Maybe we do some backyard yoga. We put some music on. I put down my yoga mat. My neighbor puts down theirs. And even without communicating, it is just comforting to know that somebody else is there and that time is built in for your neighbor to take care of themselves. If you have animals and your neighbor loves animals, you can offer up your animals for some therapy. You could also, if your neighbor has animals, offer to take the dog for a walk. Maybe that's something that she just doesn't have time for today. If your neighbor has kids, you can invite them over for a play date, offer some babysitting. And if your neighbor likes online games like Words with Friends or Farmville, that can be a really cool way to also connect and not have every conversation be about her experience of abuse.
So when we're looking at reflexivity, when we tackle allyship and harm reduction, we've pulled out some reflexivity goals for folks to consider within this part of the work that you're doing. So you want to be able to set aside your own judgments and beliefs and let your neighbor take the lead. This is the most important thing, and you're going to hear it again and again and again and again, and hopefully even again. And it's the idea that your neighbor takes the lead in these scenarios. You're doing this with your neighbor, not for your neighbor, or having your neighbor follow your lead. You want to continue to support your neighbor if they don't do what you think is right. This is another really hard thing. You're going to come up with ideas of what you think should be happening, that they should be leaving that relationship, that they should be talking to a lawyer, etc. Whatever it is that you feel that they're doing, you also have to continue to support your neighbor when they don't do what you think is right. Abuse is a very cyclical nature, like Rachel talked about, but it's also one that's a little unpredictable and deep-seated. Just continue to support and show up for your neighbor. Accept that only your neighbor knows the full situation. Particularly as you listen and learn, you're going to feel like you have a really deep understanding of this person's experience and personal understanding of their experience, but your neighbor is only going to be the only one that knows everything. You want to be invested in whatever path your neighbor chooses. Again, this goes back to number 2. It's not about what you think or the path that you would choose. It's being invested in your neighbor and their journey as they try and negotiate and understand this abusive relationship and work past it. You want to be aware and maintain your safety at all times. And the reason why I say this is because if you are inherently feeling unsafe in the work that you're doing and the support you're providing, chances are there's a risk that you're actually providing an unsafe environment for the person you're supporting too, right? So that intrinsic notion where you're like, oh, I don't feel this feels a little unsafe, also can translate into your neighbor's experience as well. So by paying attention to your own safety, it's also another cue to maintain your allyship and ensure that you're not creating any more harm for that individual that you're supporting through being involved in their scenario and this work. Jumping into section 3 here, we're going to talk about pointed interventions. So these are intervention opportunities for specific points in time. We're going to go over 4 different types of interventions. The first one is bystander training. So that's how to interrupt tense moments. We're going to talk about fleeing violence. So safety planning for those who are leaning towards or planning to flee or leave their relationship. We're going to talk about prevention. So how to talk with someone whose behaviors may become abusive and how toxic masculinity plays a role in that. And then we're going to talk about calling law enforcement. So really understanding imminent risk and the safety realities of involving police in these scenarios. I'm going to get us started first with bystander training. So I want to preface this. This isn't our own version of bystander training. What we're going to go over here is a really high level introduction to the 5Ds, which is bystander training that was developed by Hollerback. Hollerback is this incredible international organization that does bystander training around harassment, racism, sexual harassment and assault, other things. They're everywhere doing bystander training on almost everything. So I want to make sure that we pay proper consideration to the fact that we're pulling these 5Ds from their approach. We're covering them broadly, but if you are intrigued by these 5Ds, we really recommend that you access their website, ihollerback.org. We'll include that on our website. They are doing 1 hour facilitated bystander training. They're on a mission to train as many Canadians as they can. And they're going to go into more details about how you can adapt these 5Ds in a variety of different scenarios and go into more depth on each. So I always say that we're just grazing the field here. If you really like what we're grazing, to definitely sign up for this training. And again, a special consideration to Hollerback for creating such an awesome program for us to pull from for our training here. So when we're talking about Hollerback's 5Ds, the first D is distract. So the goal with this D is to directly or indirectly insert yourself in the situation to shift the scenario by causing a distraction. You can do this either verbally. I've been really big on, oh God, oh weird, what is that duck doing? For some reason, ducks turn heads in my world when I'm diffusing situations. You'll find your own duck, but something verbal that is just a little bit weird and intrigues your imagination so that the people who are having this tense moment get distracted and look for that duck. Okay, you can also do this physically. So the whole idea, you can see on the slide, there's a Santa who's sitting in between two people at a park bench. This is a great example of physically sort of inserting yourself. Santa could have stood to the side. He could have sat down on another or the other end of the bench, but he sat down right in between the two people who are having the scenario and diffused the situation with a really weird distraction. Okay, we're not all walking around with Santa suits, although if you are, please, by all means, feel inspired. But that said, there's opportunities for us to insert ourselves indirectly and seemingly easily into these scenarios to sort of break up these tense situations. So some acting cues when it comes to distracting. You want to be oblivious. You want to show no self-awareness. Make it a little bit awkward and weird. That always catches attention. You want to abandon social cues. So when we act in ways that are unexpected, based on the social cues that we walk around life with and that we kind of abide by, that's something that typically distracts people. So abandon social cues when you can. You want to stay subtle. This isn't directly taking on the abuser's behavior. You're just trying to obliviously insert yourself and cause a distraction. And the more creative you can get with this, the better. The second D from Hollerback's training is delegate. The goal with this is to find someone in charge and have them intervene. So you want to go to that person. So for example, if you're on a bus, it could be a bus driver, it could be a manager at a store, the host of a party. It could be somebody who is, running a conference or presenting somewhere. It could be someone who just, has the skills to be able to intervene in these scenarios, like a social worker, other things like that. It could be security or law enforcement as well. So you want to go to that person that you feel is in charge and has that power. Tell them what you saw and who's involved. And then you want to ask them specifically to intervene. And that part's really important because if we don't ask specifically to intervene, you run the risk of that person in charge just monitoring the situation. And potentially that person could, for example, like the people that are having the tense situation could get off the bus and it could continue on the sidewalk or other things like that. By stopping and asking that person in charge specifically to intervene, they can easily say, someone on the bus was gravely concerned and asked me to intervene. That gives them the opportunity to be able to mitigate any risk coming their way by doing that action. This is used best, like I said, if the person's in a position of power and in public situations where there's a lot of people around. If you have the opportunity to check in first with someone around law enforcement, security, guard, etc., please do. If you don't, then just try and be accountable by keeping an eye on the scenario as well. And you can always couple this with distractions. So if you need time to find someone to delegate to, tag in a friend who's a little bit weird, who's just looking for a stage, have them do some sort of distracting piece. The next D is document. And for this, it's very simple. You want to turn to your phone and you want to be recording what's happening. So in some way, you want to record what's happening. It's the idea that it can hold the abuser accountable, but also throw them off. Often abusive partners will try and save face and become show off the side of them that is very charismatic in person, in groups and in public, and then change their persona at home. So this is an opportunity for them to put on a different persona when they're having an abusive moment. You want to subtly record on your camera phone, or you can be more direct and say that, I'm filming you. If you are going to do that, just know that the violent behavior might turn towards you, and that you might run the risk of making a situation worse for the person experiencing abuse. So keep an eye on it. That said, if you don't have a phone or that's not your thing, the other thing that you can do is just stop, stare, and get other people around you to stop and stare. You might want to point or have to move in a little bit closer to the scenario in order to make your point, but you want to make sure that that person that is doing the abusive behavior understands that they have an audience. I want you to consider the ethics around documenting. You can't just walk into someone's, living room and start recording them in the scenario. This is something that's used very much in public settings, but you also want to consider the ethics and being a good human around that documenting. It might be on your phone, but it was an experience by your neighbor, and it really belongs to your neighbor who is experiencing the abuse, that documentation. So don't post it to social media, don't make a meme out of it or other things. You want to try and check in with your neighbor to see what they want done with that documentation. The next D is delay. This is going to feel like the most passive approach. However, it's super important because at the end of the day, with all of these interventions and bystander intervention, particularly, we want to make sure that your neighbor is okay. That's what we're in this for. So for this situation, it's good to use if you're worried about your safety, or if you think that there's a chance that if you use one of the other Ds, that it might escalate, or perhaps you even used one of the other Ds and you saw some escalation in that negative or violent behavior. Stop, let the situation dissipate, and then you want to check in with your neighbor and make sure they're okay. When you're doing the check-in, this is also an opportunity for you to share any documentation you took of the event. It might be that your neighbor is completely mortified and embarrassed and wants you to delete the documentation, in which case you will, or it might be that they want you to send it to their lawyer or a family member or their own phone, etc., or just keep it on your phone for when she might need it. This is another opportunity for you to provide recommendations for supports. If they ask about it, talk to them about if this happens again, when they might want law enforcement involved or when they might want you to try and intervene. And it's also a great opportunity for you to acknowledge and identify yourself as someone who wants to be part of their support network. The last D is direct. This one is where you really need to keep your safety in mind. For this, you're going to be speaking directly to the abuser about their behavior in the moment. You want to talk directly in a firm, non-confrontational voice, and you're going to call out their behaviors and what you're seeing. You want to be able to make sure you stay safe if you're doing this. Know your exit strategy and that you have a way of getting out of the scenario. You want to keep it short and to the point. This will not be the moment where everything changes and this person stops being abusive. That's not the point of this. The point of this is to stop the abuse in the moment. All right. Try not to engage in a debate or fight with the abuser. If that starts to happen, instead shift your focus onto the neighbor and making sure that they're okay. So I have a scenario here, and we're going to pull apart some opportunities to use the 5 Ds. You're at a neighborhood street party. Immediately, you see your neighbors, Jackie, who's a security guard, and Kaylee, who's a social worker at a shelter. You wave. Hi, how's it going? Off to the far side of the party is a couple. You recognize them from the house at the end of the street, but you don't know them very well. They're having what looks like a heated, angry whisper conversation. Suddenly, it all erupts into loud shouting. There's waving hands, and someone pushes the shoulder of the other person, causing a plate of food to go flying. People are looking, but no one is intervening, and things just keep escalating. What do you do? So let's start with the distract scenario. This one's one of my favorites to use. It seems to be a pretty effective D. Where I can see an opportunity for distraction is when that plate of food goes flying. So for example, when I think of myself in this scenario, I often think about going over to that plate of food, walking in between the two people that are fighting, inserting myself, abandoning social cues, picking up a strawberry off the ground, blowing it off or wiping it off, and then having a bite of that strawberry right in front of the two people that are fighting. Not only is that going to get the attention of everyone else around, but it's also going to be, I think, enough of a distraction that attention will now be on me, and all I had to do is eat a kind of dirty strawberry. You can go even more extreme with that, throw your own plate of food and it just becomes a food fight if you want to go there. In terms of delegating, you have a few people here identified that could be supports. Jackie, who's a security guard, and Kaylee, who's a social worker. But often neighborhood street parties also have somebody who seems in charge. So someone who's doing most of the organizing around it, that would be another person, or maybe it's in front of their house, etc. That would be another person you could call in. Delay would be ignoring this situation, finding another time later on in the party to touch base and just make sure your neighbor's okay. Documentation, you see here that folks are watching, which is part of the documenting D. However, it's not having impact. For those scenarios, I think pointing, saying things like, did you see this? Are you guys watching? Coming closer, trying with your phones in a recording way might give it a little bit more. But it's actually a great scenario to lean on because not all interventions automatically just work. Not all of these Ds are going to work in every scenario. So just because you're stopping and staring doesn't mean it's having an impact. So get creative and try and bring in one of the other 5 Ds. So we've done documenting, and now when we talk about direct, this would be going directly up to your neighbor who is instigating this violence, telling them what they're seeing, explaining to them that this is not the place, nor is any time the place, and that they really need to be better to their partner. However you want to phrase that and you feel comfortable, go for it. Just ensure and maybe bring in other neighbors to ensure that you're supported in that initiative.
So we're going to move into pointed intervention number 2, fleeing violence and getting ready to leave safely. The reality of the fleeing violence moment, as we might call it, is that a lot of people leave when they're not planning to. What I think we need to keep in consideration as allies to those individuals is that fleeing from someone's abuser is extremely hard. The time around that flee attempt is more dangerous before and after and can lead to a significant safety risk. This is also more often when we start hearing stories about domestic homicide. What happens is in that honeymoon phase that we referenced earlier, the abuser sinks these manipulative hooks into their partner. They want to understand them. They create environments and expect certain reactions, and when they don't get those reactions, they reinforce them with physical and sexual violence, as we think back to the power and control wheel. And in this moment, when somebody is thinking about leaving, those hooks, that power, that culture that they've created is getting shaken up a little bit. The abuser could react one of 2 ways. They could become more violent, or it can lead into that honeymoon phase where they attempt to lure their partner back in. The other important thing to know about fleeing violence is on average, it takes somebody 8 times to leave an abusive situation. And that's the average. There are people who live their whole lives with abusive partners until the partner passes away. If at any time during this process, your neighbor comes and says, I can't leave right now, I'm afraid this is getting worse, this isn't a good time for me, it's our role as allies not only to respect their decision, but to remember that they have an intuitive sense of fear. This is a survival skill that has helped them navigate the complexities of their abusive home and keep them alive in that time. Safety planning is a critical tool that we use to help keep things organized. So when the partner who is fleeing the abusive situation decides to pick up and go, we have, as much as we can as allies, done everything to support them. The link for this is a link to Women's Crisis Services Waterloo Region's safety planning website. We'll include that on our on the list of websites we're including. It's a really cool tool, so I encourage you to check it out. Things to think about when you're planning to support, when your neighbor is planning to leave as an ally, are you able to support them in opening up a bank account in their own name or their own control? Do they have an emergency pack suitcase? If so, great. If not, how can you help? Have they turned off their Snapchat map, their GPS? Have they changed the password to Find My iPhone? Are there things that you could do as an ally whose internet isn't being monitored to support with that? Is your neighbor able to set aside money, keep cash handy? Is there a way you as an ally could support them? Rerouting their important mail, address changes, pharmacy calls, things like that aren't things that people are going to remember to do in the moment, but they're things that we as allies are able to kind of keep track of for them. Are they able to take copies of documents, hide them? If not, photos, anything that indicates that somebody was living with their partner, it would be really helpful down the line. Does your neighbor have ownership of their cards, their ID? If not, are you able to get copies of photos or things like that to keep them in the meantime? Because if they leave without that, replacing it can take a while. Does your neighbor have a plan for their pets, for their children? If not, the KW Humane Society here in Waterloo region has a really good foster program for pets. And there's lots of resources out there like Women's Crisis Services that can help you plan for children. Is your neighbor able to identify and hide valuables? And do you have a plan for their accessibility needs? Can they get to the shelter? Does the shelter speak the same language as they do? Are there any mobility needs, anything that's going to help them through their day, like hearing aids, anything like that? Having a plan in place for those is really important. Now, when we're thinking back to that emergency pack suitcase, we're going to run through some packing considerations. Documentation, if you have the originals or copies or even just photos, that's great. Medications, having extra medications is important. The other thing is if you are unable to do that, communicating with the pharmacy, coming up with an alternate plan. Nobody wants somebody to continue living in violence. So how do we support them? Money, proof of relationship, again, touching base on that, valuables, assistive devices, children's things and pets things. And the last one here is almost the most important. If the abusive partner has control via the Find My Phone app on an iPhone or an Android, what will happen is once that person leaves, if they're not responding, that phone's going to get cleared. All the abusive partner has to do is log in and press clear this phone. All of those phone numbers, mom's phone number, grandma's address, all of that stuff is going to get washed away. So as an ally, is that something that you can help with? Writing down those phone numbers and addresses so that when she needs them, they're ready for her. Shelter support. Shelters, all shelters are a great first door for somebody who's fleeing violence. So here you'll see the YW Emergency Shelter represented. You see Cambridge Shelter, the bridge is represented, and then the two dragonfly symbols, which represent Women's Crisis Services Waterloo region. It's a really awesome well, it's not a program, it's a protocol. When somebody comes in the door and they say, I'm fleeing violence, there's a great opportunity for shelter staff to step in and support this person. Every door is the right door. All staff are trained, and we are going to make sure that no matter what, this person has support. So coming in to any one of these doors works. If you are supporting someone who identifies as male, the YW Emergency Shelter in Cambridge Shelter Court will be your shelter supports for that person. If the person identifies as female, trans, or non-binary, Women's Crisis Services of Waterloo region will also try to help find them a bed somewhere safe to stay.
And then for those who are joining us from outside Waterloo region, if you're looking up and want to find a shelter near you, you can go to sheltersafe.ca. Our third intervention is going to be a prevention talk. So we're going to break down a little bit of toxic masculinity and how to have a conversation that's preventative in nature with someone who might be leaning towards abusive behaviors in their relationships. So just like Rachel's been talking about, there is no subscription or prescription, to what makes someone be abusive. But there are some things that you can keep an eye out for that might escalate a behavior to lean it towards becoming abusive. So you're going to see somebody become much less patient. They're going to become more forward with their criticism of their partner. So it's going to become normalized. They're going to have more confidence while they're saying it. They're going to do it in front of larger crowds, and they're going to feed more off the reaction of sharing that criticism, both positive and negative. They're going to be avoiding their emotions, or they may be avoiding their emotions. Often big changes in behavior are tied to big life events and traumas, where they might be avoiding processing some of those things. With that comes engaging in other unhealthy coping behaviors. So an increase in alcohol use and other behaviors that are unhealthy. If you have a relationship with someone who is experiencing these, it's good to touch base with that person, especially if they're under more stress. If you see their coping going down, if they're showing more frustration, or everything seems to be frustrating them, or they're falling into these patterns of toxic masculinity. Okay, what I mean by toxic masculinity. So on the right hand side here, this is a perfect picture that encapsulates a lot of what I'm going to be talking about. You'll see this little sandwich board sign that says danger, men working above. So this is a construction site in a city. There's men up there that are working off the scaffolding. However, it's not enough that we have a big danger sign and men working above. Somebody had to graffiti in brackets real men working above. And quintessentially, this is the idea of toxic masculinity. It's the celebrated cultural norms and expectations that are associated with a particularly white and Western idea of what makes you a quote unquote real man. So in your head while I'm talking, think about that action movie poster where the guy's coming out of a big explosion and his family's dead, but he's fine. He's just getting revenge for their deaths. And for some reason, there's a puppy he's holding, but he doesn't care. He doesn't think the puppy's cute. It's just the puppy's there. And, there's things are exploding. People are calling on him to get revenge and to be this really tough, unaffected, unemotional, and scrappy person. I think we've all seen those movies perpetuated and those characters come to life. This is a real thing. This is toxic masculinity. This idea of what makes you a real man, being tough, unemotional, scrappy, and unaffected, is really keeping men from being authentic with their emotions. And it leads to things like misogyny, which is a hatred of women and girls, and homophobia, a hatred of gay people, both things that challenge this toxic masculinity. Why it's called toxic is because all of these behaviors and this sort of unaffected way of dealing with things and being tough and unemotional really leads and encourages violence. So what we want to do is use toxic masculinity in this description, not as a scapegoat for behaviors, but to understand that there's more at play than just somebody inherently feeling that they have to, that they can't express themselves. People are being taught to very actively not healthily engage in a healthy way with their emotions and their behaviors. So one of the best things you can do for the men in your life is to help them move beyond this limiting idea of who they should be. Part of this is having the sort of talk. So if you're in a scenario where someone is sort of falling victim to toxic masculinity, or perhaps just exhibiting some of those characteristics and their behaviors are going towards being abusive, these are some things that you can consider while you're supporting that person. So the first one is picking a safe place for your well-being and for them to open up. So this is dual purpose. You want to be safe in this scenario in case it goes horribly wrong, but you also want it to be a safe place for them to be able to open up, because you're about to have a very vulnerable conversation. And when you think about toxic masculinity, it's going to be a lot of work for the person hearing these words from you and engaging this conversation with you to break through that toxic masculinity. Finding a place that is special to the both of you, or has shared meaning, or is safe and private, is going to be very important. You don't want to argue with them about their toxic actions. This isn't a point of deciding the virtue of those actions. You want to avoid judgment, but you also don't want to validate their attempts to blame others for their actions. So you don't want to judge them on the fact that they're showing their frustrations more, for example, or being less patient or more criticizing of their partner. But you also don't want them to allow them the opportunity to blame their boss at work, or to blame their father or their uncle or their friend, or whatever scenario or situation. You're trying to balance that line of holding them accountable, but also knowing that you're going to be there for them. You want to be honest about your concerns. Don't go with the embellishments. Just be honest about why you're concerned, but also pair that with the being willing to support them on a different path. Again, this is a prevention conversation, which means that you're trying to get ahead of that escalating behavior, which means that it's important for them to know that you're not judging them, that you're being honest with them, and that you're going to be there for them if they choose a different direction. You want to share what you're seeing. So sometimes when we start to spiral in these negative behaviors and changes, we don't always, actually, we rarely notice ourselves going deeper into these behaviors or notice what triggers these different changes until we reflectively go back after the fact and do that work. So you're in an interesting position where you can share what you're seeing. Things like, I noticed when dad died that all of a sudden you became, everything frustrated you. Or I noticed when you took on this new job that you are much more forward with your criticisms of your partner because you feel like there's less time in the day with household chores, whatever it is. You want to just be very candid about what you're seeing and where there's opportunities to notice a change in that person or some external factor, and how that impacted them. You want to acknowledge their stress and the other life realities that might be causing their behavior and actions. Again, with toxic masculinity and not being able to actually express those emotions or being taught not to express those emotions, acknowledging someone, I know that you're very stressed. I know that when dad died, this was a big deal, or when you took on this new job or promotion, or when you lost your job, etc. These were all really big things. You know, it's not easy to deal with all of these things. And then lastly, you want to check in with yourself throughout. This is not necessarily going to go as smooth as I just shared with you here. It could be very hard. This could be a point where you sever a relationship for a while, or it could be the exact moment in time that needed to happen to prevent that person from being abusive to their partner. You want to check in with yourself throughout with the reflexivity questions, especially if you're not noticing it going and flowing like you thought it was going to.
Pointed intervention number 4, calling law enforcement. Best practices for situations of imminent harm. So imminent harm, I use a lot, but it's not a word everybody uses. So we're going to define it. In my mind, imminent harm means without immediate intervention, something life-changing and negative will happen. So when I'm thinking about imminent harm, I'm thinking about situations of domestic homicide, which is death by abuser, or other significant physical injuries. This is a moment where most people have legitimate fear for somebody else's well-being. In this moment, most people call the police. And we're going to talk about calling law enforcement, because sometimes calling law enforcement is an escalation factor for violence. Sometimes the police lack training, or they make assumptions that makes it harder for them to appropriately respond, which leads to a lack of action and for your neighbor to feel unsupported. Sometimes cultural and other factors make calling the police unsafe or even a threat to your neighbor. But sometimes calling the police will be the best option for safety. Sometimes it will be your only option to stop imminent harm. And then sometimes the abuser may be in law enforcement, or maybe they have friends in law enforcement or are connected to the courts. A really clear example of a time where police didn't have the training that they needed in that moment is when one of my clients disclosed that her partner used to put his cigarettes out on her. And so in front of police, he was smoking a cigarette and putting it down. That is a threat to her that police were not aware of. And it really limited her ability to disclose what the situation was to police in that moment. So my hope is, as allies supporting people that may need to call the police at times, you have an opportunity to check in with your neighbor before the situation gets to that point to see how they feel about law enforcement or what you might need to know about that situation. Having that conversation will allow you to build in actions for involving or not involving the law enforcement component in the safety plan, because some people would rather you call a family member or a friend, and then other people will ask for you to handle it differently. So documenting events can be helpful if your neighbor consents to that, including a written safety plan. In the case that you do have to call police, it can be really helpful not to call them anonymously, The thing is, if you call anonymously, police don't follow up with you afterwards. What might happen is they may walk into that situation and not see grounds for an immediate apprehension. This leaves your neighbor in a potentially more dangerous situation. So what you want to do is to agree to them following up with you afterwards. When the police come to you, get the occurrence number. This is a number that police use to track incidents that they respond to. It's really helpful for your neighbor in the case that she ever needs information that the police had gathered to just have that number. That way, when she calls dispatch, she doesn't have to go in through all of her memories about a specific night at a specific time. That's a lot for her. So just getting this number is a huge time saver. If you're able to get the badge numbers from the police, that's also really helpful. Once you're talking to the police, you're able to give them a little bit more context, saying things like, oh yeah, this situation has been going on for a while. We have a safety plan. And being able to show them that gives them the context that they need to sometimes change their intervention style. Police often know that they aren't always the best resource, but they also know that they're the ones that's there. So if you're able to give them things and work collaboratively with them in supporting your neighbor, it can be really helpful to making sure that the intervention goes the way the neighbor and you had planned. The other piece, and the most important piece, is to check in with your neighbor after the experience. The thing is, the post-intervention is just as important as the actual intervention. So section 4. Post-intervention, moving beyond just the intervention. We know statistically that it takes on average 8 times for somebody to leave an abusive situation. And we know that that's an average. Sometimes people leave right away, sometimes they never leave. But that doesn't mean that they've never experienced an intervention. The important part as an ally is that we ask ourselves this question: did the intervention not work at all? Or did it just not work the way I wanted it to? Because this is a highly emotional situation, you're going to have an investment, and that's very human. However, we need to keep in mind the cycle of violence. We need to keep in mind the power and control wheel and all of those tactics, like using children against somebody, right? Economic abuse, somebody being afraid of being asked to leave the country. Emotional abuse, somebody feeling that their emotional worth is completely tied to their relationship. We're going to think about the differences in oppression and privilege that you experience versus what your neighbor experiences. And then we're also going to be thinking about that cycle of abuse again, right? The honeymoon phase, the tension building phase, and that acute or crisis. If you had an intervention where you called the police, you're frequently doing that in the crisis stage. But anywhere else too, that cycle is going to keep moving. What we need to do as allies is remember that the frustration response is not helpful. We don't want to put the person we are supporting between us and the abuser, because the manipulation in that abusive relationship means that you will always lose, and that's not helpful to her. So we're not going to say things like the abuser is no longer welcome in your home. We're not going to use the kids as emotional blackmail. We're not going to create situations where our neighbor is forced to choose between their abuser and something else. We don't want to personally attack their character, and we don't want to take hard stances that puts them in the middle. We also don't want to criticize the abusive partner's character, because we don't want our neighbor to have to feel as though they need to defend their abuser. If you've been identified as somebody being involved in an intervention, you will likely be iced out. This is because the abuser is looking to maintain that power and control that we talked about earlier. There's ways to work against this though. So one of them is to tag in a lesser known member of your social circle. Engage the abuser on a series of completely unrelated topics, like that tree at the end of the street. It's so overgrown, someone's gonna get in a car accident. Or maybe you take a step back. You let things settle, especially if you notice that honeymoon phase has moved in with the periods of kindness, the promises about the future, things like that. If you find a safe way to let your neighbor know you're still there for them, you're still available when they are ready for you. So this could include going back to that safe and routine connection. If you're playing Words with Friends and it's your move the tile, see if they respond. The other half of this, it's this being quite an emotionally heavy situation, we need to check ourselves with some post-intervention reflexivity. We're going to ask ourselves, how do I manage my disappointment and not put that on the other person? What was a roadmap of how I felt this intervention should have gone down based on my own opinions and privilege? How will I manage the ugly feeling that my neighbor failed or that I made the wrong decision in helping? How do I process my anger in ways that don't increase isolation or risk of harm to my neighbor? And as a known accomplice, how am I going to interact with my neighbor and or their abuser in the future in a way that doesn't bring more violence? Most importantly, the question you need to ask yourself is, how am I going to continue to support my neighbor without judgment? So this is the end of our training. We're going to finish with a quick wrap up. We recognize that talking about abuse comes with a heavy weight, but our goal is to decrease that weight and remind people living with abuse that they aren't alone and connect them to a greater network of support, a network of neighbors.